Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. We're getting ready for the global showdown. Central bank, that being the IMF in this case, versus Bitcoin. The venue, Argentina. That's why we're here. We're here now. We're witnessing historic, epic, proportion events. Stacy.
Yes, of course, when we booked to come here, the currency crisis was not in such a full swing. Now it is. We have a new president-elect here, and he has turned down the last $11 billion payment from the IMF. But I just want to say in our observations, I'm here with the national color here of I feel like I look like Lionel Messi.
Go Messi! 6 golden balls. Wow, that must be heavy.
I have been a little bit surprised about how would you say, posh, hours and hours of walking across the city in all sort of directions, that it feels probably even more prosperous than living in Paris, being in Paris. It is kind of odd to see this situation, and I think part of it is that they're so used to currency crises here that it's almost like they're so prepared for it that when it comes, it's like, oh, great, everything's discounted for us.
Well, the Argentinians are resourceful people, and you can't take away their dignity. And that's what they have, and it's based on a fantastic culture, fantastic people. Here in Buenos Aires, you're meeting so many fantastic people, and the cultural depth is extraordinary, unlike the U.S., where there really is no culture other than Hollywood. Here you have hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years of culture. You've got the influence of folks coming from all over the world, principally Italian, and it's just fantastic. And you know, what we're seeing here is a resilience to the overlords from the central banks like the IMF. And for the first time in history, a country like Argentina has a weapon to fight the carpetbaggers at the IMF, the charlatans like Christine Lagarde, and that would be Bitcoin. And I noticed on local Bitcoin, use in Bitcoin in Argentina is skyrocketing. This is where ground zero is, in the Bitcoin versus central bank. It's happening right here in Buenos Aires, right here in Argentina.
Yes, the population of Argentina has soared since 1880. Prior to that, there was about 2 million people here, and now there's 40-something million. But I just want to go over the data on the economy, and just so you understand, according to the, I guess it's the World Bank data, $518 billion is their GDP in 2018, and that's down from about $637 billion in 2017. You know, this guy, Mauricio Macri, he was hailed kind of in the Western press anyway as a great neoliberal reformer, and he's going to bring deregulation and all sorts of boom times for the economy. But he did end up taking a $57 billion IMF loan in 2018. 44 billion of that has been dispensed, and since August they've spent 22 billion of it just defending their currency.
Well, look, the military junta of, 1976? This is a U.S.-sponsored coup aided by Henry Kissinger.
We're going to talk about that in the next episode, indeed, yeah.
Yeah, and, you know, basically this is the root of the problem, is the destruction brought on by external forces, the foreigners meddling in the Argentinian politics. Then you had, of course, Paul Singer and the hedge funds on Wall Street funded by fiat money printed by central banks. Christine Lagarde is IMF central bank. She's in bed with Paul Singer. Those two are together.
She's now at the ECB, but indeed she was at the IMF when they were negotiating this deal.
ECB, another central bank, of course. And she's in bed with Paul Singer and the junta, the same mentality. It's a coup.
Let's talk about foreign intervention because, of course, the currency has fallen by over 50% here. Inflation is raging. I've seen numbers between 38 and 55% inflation rate. Here's a tweet as we were flying down here. So Trump restores tariffs on steel and aluminum shipped from Argentina and Brazil, citing concern about both countries devaluing their currency. Now, usually this sort of intervention of tariffs in order to fight devaluation of currency is done when the devaluation is done intentionally. I really believe this is not done intentionally. This was, in fact, they've thrown $22 billion of an IMF loan into stabilizing the currency. So this is Trump, however, acting like a tough guy without any real information.
Again, Argentina has been a punching bag for American empire. as is all of South America. And it's all accomplished using fiat money and the machinations of central banks. And again, the people in Argentina are fighting back. Usage of Bitcoin locally is skyrocketing, and that's their way out of this morass to fight the Christine Lagardes, fight Donald Trump, fight the ECB with hard money, Bitcoin. And that's what's happening now. This is ground zero. This is where the revolution is really taking hold.
Well, you're going to speak to somebody in the second half who is American, who lives there, and this is one of his observations, is that people, because they're so used to currency crisis, in a way that makes you a much more resilient person. In America, obviously, we haven't had currency crises since 1971, and since we had that currency crisis, since we essentially defaulted to our debts to France and Britain and other nations, our currency crisis became their crisis. Here, they suffer it, so they have a long history of already protecting themselves with hard assets, with property, with gold, with Bitcoin, with things like that, with replacements that are more stable than their currency. So that's why, at the moment anyway, there's a sense of calm here. Who knows what will happen? Everybody saw those images of what happened in 2001, 2002.
Look, sanctions are an act of war. And
this is, tariffs on Brazil, and
right.
So he's saying that their steel is cheaper than American steel.
Right.
And
tariffs, sanctions, this type of activity is an act of war. And the U.S. Hasn't had a good war track record since World War II. They frickin' lost in Vietnam due to the guerrilla warfare of the Vietnamese. And in Argentina and all over South America, armed with the guerrilla war currency of Bitcoin, America could lose again.
We're going to go into some of the data again about the specifics of Argentina and what they're doing to resist this sort of a crisis getting worse. Because remember, we have a change of government, and Argentina sets floor under peso as reserves dwindle. This was Macri in his last month or two in office, and he said Argentina's central bank is setting a price floor under the volatile peso and hopes to avoid a sharp plunge in the currency after an opposition-won presidential election shifted the country firmly back to the left. So they've basically thrown $22 billion, as I've said. Authorities have also been rushing to stem a sharp decline in foreign currency reserves after spending about $22 billion to defend the peso since business-friendly Macri was defeated heavily in an August 11th primary election. They still do have 61.74 tons of gold in their reserves, and that has been there since basically 2004.
Right, they've been buying gold.
They have not bought any gold in particular since 2004, but since 2004 they had 0.28 tons of gold. Now they have 61.74 tons of gold.
Right, so that's the smart move. That's what countries are doing to fight American fiat money jihad, is they're buying gold. And whether they're doing it in Russia, China, Turkey, or Argentina, this is the way to achieve economic sovereignty. If you want to get out of the U.S. empire of debt, you must buy gold, you must buy Bitcoin as a sovereign.
Yes, as an individual, on the nation-state level, it tends to be gold, but perhaps some are buying Bitcoin.
If the Argentinian central bank were starting to buy Bitcoin, the Argentinian peso would immediately be one of the soundest currencies in the world. They're
defending their currency, $22 billion. I think it just gets thrown into the Forex market. It just disappears.
Yeah, that's a waste of money. They should use that money to mine Bitcoin. Obviously, if they want a hard currency and they want to get out of the U.S. empire, they should stop throwing good money after bad. And they'll never appease the IMF. The IMF is that crocodile, as Winston Churchill called the act of appeasement, that never gets satiated. He rips off your arm, then he rips off your body. It never appeased the IMF, never appeased a financial terrorist, never. Going
back to this, they've thrown $22 billion at the problem. They could have perhaps seen a lesson with what Elvira did in Russia. She let the currency float, and the currency did sink by 60%, like very rapidly. But the exchange rate mechanism is a stabilizer. It causes not only substitution, but it also increases your exports. Luckily, they're self-sufficient in energy and agricultural products, so that, unlike Venezuela, for example, which has to import all its food, so it's very reliant on getting hard currency. In terms of the U.S. running the IMF, Steve Mnuchin did weigh in on this because they have a new government here, and U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said on Wednesday the United States expected the new president, Fernandez, to uphold the country's commitment to the terms of the $57 billion IMF loan program agreed last year with conservative incumbent Mauricio Macri. The president-elect will have to balance the IMF commitments while dealing with rising levels of poverty, which have risen amid the economic malaise. Protesters marched on Thursday in the center of Buenos Aires to protest austerity measures under Macri and the IMF with the slogan, "The debt is with the people, not the IMF."
No, if the U.S. allowed that wild dog, Paul Singer, to commit all kinds of act of financial vandalism in Argentina, they have no commitment, no obligation to fulfill their IMF commitment whatsoever, because this is a financial war, and in financial war, all is game in financial war, and they have no commitment, no obligation whatsoever.
Well, because thousands of years of history is what they should look at, rather than the last 40 years of a fiat empire of debt. It's only been since the last financial crisis of 2008 whereby it's this notion that creditors should always be made whole, and that there's, it's always for history been two-sided. If it causes moral hazard if you constantly bail out either the creditor or debtor. But if you're going to lend money to a nation, remember, it was only 2 years ago that the 100-year bond by Argentina was oversubscribed. They raised $2.7 billion. It's now worth like 54 cents on the dollar or even less. But people were lining up to lend to them. They had already defaulted to the IMF and only paid back 30% of that from 2001 through 2005. They were likely to default on this, and the creditors should learn. This should be a lesson for the IMF. And in terms of the new president, Alberto Fernandez, Argentina's president-elect rejects remaining IMF money. Argentina's leftist president-elect Alberto Fernandez said he would renounce the remaining $11 billion tranche of the country's International Monetary Fund loan as he takes office next month, which is this month. He said, quote, "I have an enormous problem, and I'm going to ask for $11 billion more," the incoming president said in an interview on Argentina's Radio Con Voz. Fernandez said he will try to revive the economy in order to pay and solve the debt problem sensibly. "We want them not to lend us more money, but to let us develop. Let's discuss the time I need to develop, but don't give me more money."
Right. Fernandez is on the right track. It's not about don't lend me more money, we need to develop. It's about don't lend me more money, we're going to start buying more gold, and we're going to start encourage individual economic sovereignty through BitCoin, and we're going to have a really strong currency, much stronger than the U.S. dollar, or the IMF special drawing right, which is the new fiat money from the IMF. So all their fiat money has failed. So they decided to create a new form of fiat money called the special drawing right, and they're going to ask Argentina and Chile and Iran and who knows who else to roll up all their bad debts into an IMF facility, a $100 trillion lending facility, because all the people in the IMF make huge billions of dollars in fees selling garbage.
But again, we'll wrap it up here. And what I want to say is that Mark Carney earlier in 2019 did say at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, at the meeting of central bankers, he said that the U.S. dollar was no longer fit for purpose. And he did specifically indicate countries like Argentina, whereby currency crises are basically caused by the grid, the system of using the U.S. fiat as a unit of account, because the whole way the flows, the capital flight in and out of the dollar, and it was the dollar rising by so much in the past 2 years that started this the currency crisis here. So, yeah.
Why would you have a world reserve currency based on paper that there's no limit to print the paper?
Exactly.
Right. So you're going to have, and then the people who print the paper get a fee for printing the paper, and anyone who's reliant on using that paper, like Argentina, is going to get, completely, I don't know.
Obliterated.
Obliterated is a good word. Okay, much more coming your way. Empanadas for everybody. Don't go away. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Nick Giambruno. You can find his writings about gold and other cool stuff at kcresearch.com. Nick, welcome.
Hey, Max. Great to be with you.
Nice to see you again. Now, you travel extensively, and you have lived all over the world. You spend part of your time here in Buenos Aires. Give us your impression of the current situation here to outsiders like me and Stacy. It seems calm enough on the outside. What are we missing? What's going on here?
Sure. Well, Argentina has gone through a number of financial crises in the past 100 years, and it looks like it's on the cusp of another one. The last really big one was in 2001, and what is happening here is the currency is really on a foundation of sand right now. It's living and dying by the whims of IMF bailout money. So Argentina is on the cusp of a possible currency crisis, which is relatively normal for this country. It's happened repeatedly over the past 100 years, and that's what we're looking at right now, and there's reasons for that. 100 years ago, Argentina and the U.S. were really kind of on the same level. I mean, you've seen it walking around here. There's beautiful buildings. That was kind of the golden era of Argentina 100 years ago. There used to be a saying called "rich as an Argentine" back then. That's changed a lot since Argentina instituted a central bank and the politicians.
What year was that?
That was 1935, so a little bit after the U.S., when the U.S. instituted the Fed, obviously, in 1913. So Argentina had that golden era prior to that establishment of the central bank. Then, of course, like in most places, the central bank is the magic money machine for the politicians, and that's really how Argentina started its long descent downhill, is when the politicians discovered they had this magic money machine, and that's led to, in a nutshell, in the past 100 years, 4 currency collapses, and now we look to be on the cusp of the 5th.
And the political upheaval of 1976, of course, is seen as a seminal moment in chaos in terms of the finances. That's a fair statement?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Fair enough. We first met in Beirut back in 2011. You spend a part of your here in Buenos Aires. The latest currency crisis has begun. So you just described it. You gave us a bit of a history there. You're at International Man over there with Doug Casey.
Yes.
I know he has a place in Argentina as well. So how do you position Argentina in the International Man view of things? You spent some time here, but you're very, I guess, agile and moving around the world, et cetera. How does Argentina fit into the global picture?
Yes, sure. So this picture I just described, and currency crises and financial collapses are obviously scary. But if there's one place that is not necessarily accustomed to it, but resilient to it to a degree, it's Argentina.
Why?
Well, they've been through it. They know this is not their first rodeo, so to say. They know how to deal with it. They know how to cope with it. So if the currency goes to zero, there is already this infrastructure in place in this country to kind of deal with the situation. It's happened before. It will happen again soon.
Are they more resilient than other South American countries?
I believe they are.
Why is that?
Because their whole economy is geared towards kind of the underground, not their whole economy, but a large part of their economy is used to dealing with the underground market. For example, the currency, nobody uses this as a long-term savings value, or businesses, they don't plan in advance. So what they do is they use the underground market for dollars, which is the de facto next best thing for
There's a lot of what I would call social cohesion.
Yes.
That seems to be driven by immigration. They have immigration from all over the world. And all these immigrants are forced to come together into this melting pot called Argentina, and they all bring their little tricks of the trade with them. And they develop this underground economy, and they're extraordinarily resilient because they're diverse. Diversity equals resiliency. And some other countries that are less open to immigration, it's less resistant because they're less diverse. What do you think?
Yes, well, there's an old joke that an Argentine is an Italian who speaks Spanish, but thinks that he's British and lives in a French house. So that speaks to that point you're making right there.
Right. It's speaking of France, they have this idea of System D in France, which is that we just always get démarrage or something. They always figure out a way to get through. There's cohesion there. Now, only 2 or 3 years ago, Nick, Argentina was able to sell a 100-year bond. Now, within 2 years, they were begging the IMF for $57 billion. Why did Macri's government borrow so much from the IMF? Let's talk about the IMF's role in all this, Nick.
Oh, sure. The vampire, of course. So the thing is that this is an indication of how the world is drunk on fiat money and all the insanity that follows. Argentina issuing 100, not only was it issued, Max, it was oversubscribed. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was, people were begging to give Argentina money for 100 years.
And they just declared bankruptcy a few years earlier.
Yes.
And so they're going to take this bankrupt country and say, we're going to do a 100-year bond.
It's insane.
And it's oversubscribed.
It's insane. It's insane. So why do they issue the 100-year bond and then go to the IMF for the largest bailout package the IMF has ever made in its entire existence? Well, it's because the currency is about to collapse, and they're using a lot of that money to kind of prop up the economy here, prop up the currency here. I mean, think of it on an individual level. Does it make any sense, well, you know, knowing that the peso is not the best currency, would you, Max, go personally into debt in U.S. dollars and buy Argentine pesos, knowing you'd have to pay that loan back in dollars?
If they were backed by empanadas, I might.
Yes, yes. Nonetheless, that's what Argentina is facing. And unfortunately, Argentina, the way it's set up with how the government is spending money, they can't afford it internally. So they kind of need an external sugar daddy, so to say, whether it's going to be the IMF, the hedge funds in New York, unfortunately, or, you know, China's another option.
You go from the vultures at the IMF to the parasites of Paul Singer in the hedge fund world. I mean, I just saw a report on a big mainstream media network in the U.S. Tucker Carlson did a big story on Paul Singer and the way he vaporized some towns in the U.S. using his predatory kleptocracy method and underhanded shenanigans. But he's been doing this globally for years, principally in Argentina. I think he tried to seize some Argentinian government assets at one point.
Well, exactly. And I think there is a third way. So if you don't want to be slaves to the bankers, slaves to the hedge funds, slaves to the IMF, or slaves to the Chinese, hopefully a new third way will emerge, and that's kind of where this crypto comes into play in Argentina. But to go back to what you're saying about the IMF, you know, so there are rumors. I can't say this for a fact, but there are rumors. So why would the IMF give $50-something billion to a country that's repeatedly defaulted? Well, obviously there's geopolitical concerns, but also there's rumors that they've pledged the prime real estate of Argentina, Patagonia, which is pristine, has fresh water, the glaciers. It's like one of the most beautiful places on Earth.
What?
So it seems like they
pledged Patagonia?
It's rumored to.
It's a rumor.
It's a rumor, but I wouldn't be surprised.
You're a sharp guy, Nick. You've got your ear to the ground. This rumor, how much traction does it have out there? Because if that's true, it's an absolute catastrophe in mega proportions.
Well, if you look at who is interested in Patagonia, the elites are very interested in Patagonia. They have all sorts, they're buying all sorts of property there, not just Hollywood elites, banking elites, political elites. When Obama used to visit Argentina, he would sneak away to Patagonia. Nobody knew what he would really do in Patagonia. He'd sneak away to Patagonia for a few days. Nobody would really know of it outside of Argentina unless you followed the Argentine press, but what the heck was he doing in Patagonia? So there are a lot of elites buying up property in Patagonia. Obviously, it's like a bug-out location for them, too. Obviously, something interests them. I'm not quite sure what, but it's something to watch.
Right. Let's talk about, they still have 61.74 tons of gold in their reserves, and which is up from under half a ton in 2001. Of course, over there at Keiser Research, an international man, you guys have a strong focus on gold. Tell us about Argentina and gold.
I wish the Argentines, instead of looking towards the dollar when their currency goes you know, I wish they would look towards gold, and I think they will. Eventually they will, because, you know, you think of it like this. Think of it, you know, the market for money. You have the Argentine peso, you have the dollar, you have gold and Bitcoin, but most people are familiar with the dollar. So think of it like any other essential good, like bottles, water, for example. Like you have Dasani and you have Evian. Well, what if Dasani started to get brown, started to make people sick? It was obviously not good. Nobody would want it, so they would go to Evian. That would look good too. But the problem is that next best thing, the dollar, is also going to turn brown. It's also going to make people sick soon. So I think that is going to help people in Argentina.
They've got Stockholm Syndrome.
Yes.
Because the U.S. went off the gold standard in '71, and then Kissinger was given the green light to overthrow Chile, totally destroy Argentina, and destroy South America, because they had all the fiat money in the world to do so. They could just print their way into this empire of debt and just destroy lives. And yeah, they've had currency crisis here for 100 years, but not since the overthrow in '76 has things been as chaotic as they are now. And you have these parasites and vultures on your doorstep with that easy money that they're willing to loan to you at exorbitant rates. Meanwhile, they get no interest whatsoever on their loans, and they're making out like bandits, increasing their wealth exponentially, and everyone else is suffering. And they do the divide and conquer. So you've got the socialists, or at war with the kleptocrats, and right. So now they're looking internally. They don't understand that the problem is fiat money.
Absolutely. You talk often about the Cantillon effect. Well, the Cantillon effect is on steroids here in Argentina because, as you said, it's, a lot of it is driven by fiat money. Well, where have they used fiat money to kind of hollow out the middle class, suck up all the wealth, and give it to something? It's here. Here is a great example of that. But you're totally right in terms of what these folks are doing with the debts, and that's why it's urgent because.
All right, how's Bitcoin doing? I see Bitcoin adoption skyrocketing.
Yes.
Is that a suddenly woke population realizing they want individual sovereignty? There's a way out of U.S. dollar hegemony with Bitcoin?
I think that's certainly a large part of it, too. They see what's going on with the U.S., these predatory institutions like the IMF, and this is kind of that third way I was talking about before. So if you don't want to be slaves to the IMF, you don't want to be slaves to the Chinese, Bitcoin offers a third way. And I think that is a big reason why people are waking up to Bitcoin and crypto in Argentina on a relatively higher level than other countries.
All right, Nick Giambruno from Keiser Research, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks, Max.
And stick around for another segment. We like you. You showed us where all the good steak is.
Yes.
It's all grass-fed and yummy.
Good.
And super cheap. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Nick Giambruno. If you want to catch us on Twitter, it's Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.